Welcome to the Crime Redefined podcast, produced by Zero Cliff Media. Coming to you from the U.S. Bank Tower, high above downtown Los Angeles. In our podcast, we drill deep into forensics and criminal investigation from the viewpoint of the defense, as well as explore the intersection of the media and the justice system.
On this episode of Crime Redefined, we have the good fortune of interviewing Jeff Mudgett. Jeff is the great-great-grandson of Herman Webster Mudgett, also known as H.H. Holmes, who Jeff also believes is the infamous Jack the Ripper.
Yeah, Jeff is a really nice and interesting guy, and he penned the book Bloodstains back in 2011. And more recently, he starred in history's 8-episode series American Ripper, which premiered in 2017. In American Ripper, Jeff and a partner investigate the evidence that Holmes and Jack the Ripper were one and the same. At the very end of the show, science seems to have solved a part of the mystery, or did it?
H.H. Holmes was America's first serial killer. It's unclear exactly how many people he murdered, but many people believe it's in the hundreds.
Holmes constructed what came to be known as the infamous Murder Castle in Chicago. This was a 3-story hotel which was designed specifically and efficiently to facilitate Holmes' killings. It was conveniently located near the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, which presented a huge opportunity for Holmes to rack up the victims.
Holmes designed the murder castle with soundproof rooms, trap doors, and rooms with gas lines that he could use to suffocate his victims. Holmes also had a chute that would conveniently deliver bodies to the basement where he could perform his work in privacy.
Yeah, Holmes was a trained doctor, and he definitely used his medical training to his advantage in his killing and in covering his tracks. And, Dion, this was murder for profit. Holmes would actually dissect and skin the bodies so that he could sell the skeletons to medical schools. And then, using acid and fire, Holmes would attempt to get rid of the evidence of this sick enterprise.
The guy is absolutely unbelievable. I mean, it's clear that Holmes was a prolific killer, but he was even a better con artist. With multiple wives, insurance scams, and grave robbing were the norm for him. His final scheme illustrated the full spectrum of his evil. He conspired to fake the death of his business partner, Benjamin Peitzel, in an attempt to collect a $10,000 life insurance policy.
Yeah, he was a bit of a Renaissance man in a bad way. And the only problem with that last scheme is that it wasn't good enough for Holmes to fake a death. He actually killed Peitzel as well as 3 of his children for good measure. And just kind of fast-forwarding the story, eventually insurance investigators arrested him in Boston in 1894. And for part of his criminal trial, Holmes actually acted as his own attorney. So he was sort of MD-JD Holmes. He was ultimately convicted and was executed by hanging in 1896.
Well, you're going to learn a lot. And as you will hear in our interview with Jeff, it just may be that H.H. Holmes saved his best scam for last, escaping the gallows by having yet another victim occupy his grave in his place.
Well, you can't put it past him, can you, Dion?
Absolutely not.
And there's certainly a plethora of circumstantial evidence that would link Holmes to the Jack the Ripper killings, which actually predated the Murder Castle fiasco. And the evidence presented in American Ripper attempts to show a couple of things. That Jack the Ripper was an American doctor, that Holmes cannot be accounted for in the U.S. during the time period of the Ripper killings, and in fact, that Holmes traveled to London at the right time. And finally, in American Ripper, they present evidence that H.H. Holmes penned the notorious Dear Boss and Saucy Jack the Ripper letters.
Well, there you have it. There's a short background to what is a complex, gruesome, and fascinating tale. So what do you think? You ready to hear Jeff's story?
I cannot wait.
Hey, Jeff, how are you doing today?
Excellent. I've been looking forward to your show. I've admired what subjects you guys carry, and I'm looking forward to being part of it.
Great. Well, let's get started. And first, let's go backwards before we go forwards. And my first question is, when you were a young man, what did you feel was different about yourself?
Yeah, I knew there were differences. I don't know if I had a title for each. There were idiosyncrasies which, my mom used to try to explain off as a mother would, and my dad used to tell me to grow out of it and grow up and move on. But they bothered me. Things that I often wondered whether other people thought as solemn matters as I often did. And, when it came to be 40, I found out what it was all about.
So, Jeff, tell us about the significance of your middle name being Lee and your grandmother's interest in genealogy.
Well, that was her talking my mother and father into using that middle name because she was convinced we were the direct descendants of General Robert E. Lee of Civil War fame. And as she grew older and more successful, my grandparents were quite wealthy in the Central California Valley there. She took up genealogy when it wasn't something you could just Google up. You had to hire a team of investigators who would go off for months, even years, and come back with a final position paper on who your ancestors had actually been.
So she really made an investment in this to find out all your family genealogy.
She told me once she spent $20,000 on it.
Wow. Take us inside that family dinner when the dark secret of your great-great-grandfather was revealed. Can you set the stage and, maybe, what you guys were talking about beforehand, like really take us inside that room.
All right. And then you guys can, if you just close your eyes, you can imagine your own family dinner party with brothers, sisters, cousins there, uncles, aunts, everyone. And grandma taking center stage as she often did because my grandfather was this very quiet, stoic man. And her starting off cheerful and happy, describing, the results coming back in from the genealogy study, but then having to inform us that the conclusion hadn't come out as she planned. And as a matter of fact, the head manager of the entity had told her that he would have preferred just to call her on the phone and ask her to let sleeping dogs lie. This wasn't going to be one of his favorite reports to someone who was obviously very interested in her genealogy. And then to her credit, Grandma told us the truth, that there was no Robert E. Lee, that there was a serial killer from Chicago named Herman Webster Mudgett, a.k.a. H.H. Holmes, to the newspapers and the media.
Nowadays you go on 23andMe or Ancestry.com and you get some family secrets. Maybe you found out that your father wasn't faithful. You've got some half siblings, but man, to find that out, that must have rocked your world.
Well, when I did some research the next couple of days, it did, finding out that not only he was an evil genius, a psychotic killer, psychopathic liar, a master of the occult, lover of the ladies, and the ladies loved him back, and then a macabre comedian to boot, who the Chicago Tribune called the greatest con that ever struck Chicago.
How long did...
Then you're right. It struck me right between the eyes.
How long did it take your family sitting around the table to absorb what she was telling you?
If you had a nickel to flip, you could probably get a 50-50 on each one. Some just kept eating her chicken dumplings, which were world famous. My brother was needling me in the ribs with his elbow, mostly because he could see grandfather staring directly at me. And we both figured out it was because, I was practicing law in California. I favored the criminal defense side. And it was obvious that he was bothered by me being at the table and her telling the family this secret. And in the blink of an eye, guys, he stood up, slammed his chair back against the wall. The picture came down onto the floor, slammed his fist down on the table. It shook, and said that name, Herman Webster Mudgett, will never be mentioned in this house again, and stormed out of the room. And that was something, it's one of those things you can imagine I'll never forget the rest of my life.
Jeff, out of curiosity, before that fateful day, how long had you been practicing criminal law?
I'd gone to the Merchant Marine Academy. I'd sailed ships on the Far East for 5 or 6 years. I'd come back. That had bored me. I'd come back. I decided, admiralty law was what I wanted to do. I wanted to practice sea law. So I went to the University of San Diego and got my degree and passed my California bar, and lo and behold, started defending bar pilots in Los Angeles and San Francisco Bay. And that went on for a while, but then I started branching off to where I was intrigued with the defense side, as I'm sure both of you are, and how the things that many people just accept as verbatim, I like to question. Especially when you were talking about a man going to prison. And that's pretty much what my life became. And that's where this investigation, this research into who Holmes really was, I've always thought was an origin or a destiny.
That's a great segue from my next question. When you began to research Holmes, what was the initial aha moment that caused you to believe that he could also be Jack the Ripper?
I was contacted by a man. I started going to as many events about Holmes as I could. I set aside my law career. I realized that this was something that had been put at my doorstep, which wasn't something I could just write off and continue my life. It needed to be addressed because there was so much legend and lore and storytelling about Holmes. There were hundreds of books. I knew that most of the books were based on his own quotes, and I quickly realized, having worked with defendants, that he was a liar. Most of the things he wrote or told news media was lies. So, I started attending most of those events, and I ran into a fellow that gave a talk that he'd spent 10 years of his life convinced that Holmes was Jack the Ripper, and he and I started going back and forth a little bit. There was intriguing parts to his theory. There wasn't anything I could have taken to court. But then I was alerted by a member of the FBI that there was an outfit at the University of Buffalo, and they had just completed a software program in analyzing handwriting and comparing them with data instead of just two experts getting on the stand and arguing with each other. And I contacted Dr. Srihari at the University of Buffalo, and he agreed to run the famous Dear Boss letter.
Okay, hold that thought, because we're gonna come to that. Because I have an aha moment, a question for you around that. So hold that thought just for a second. But I have a quick little follow-up question. Was there anybody else in your family who, I hate to use the word embraced this, but kind of went all in on the research and the history? Or were you just kind of on an island?
Oh, no, they were quite upset. They wanted me to do what the Mudgett family had done for a century, basically move west to get away from the stigma and just let it lie. But as you both know, that's impossible these days with the information flows.
That's right.
And I knew there were going to be books. The Devil in the White City. I didn't know that one was going to come out, but I knew one like it was going to come out. There were going to be movies. There were going to be Leonardo DiCaprio starring Holmes. So I wasn't going to run away from it. But my mother supported me. She would have supported me, guys, had I been sentenced to prison. Okay, I was one of those lucky guys that has an incredible mother. And my father was the backbone of my venture. He was a Navy fighter pilot that if his son considered it worthwhile, he was going to back him up. And that's, those two have stuck with me the whole way.
Oh, that's great.
Well, Jeff, I was interested to learn that Holmes acted as his own attorney during his trial. And from what I read, that as soon as he started doing voir dire for jury selection, it was obvious that he had a knack for it. How did he perform during the rest of the trial?
I was so thrilled to see that you both were excited about that, because it's very, I'll tell you what, I've done hundreds of shows and I've maybe had two hosts raise the issue of the trial and how intriguing it was, because I've long thought that the Holmes murder trial should be required reading at law school today in America. It's one of the most fascinating murder trials you're ever going to read. It's one where an obvious, intelligent man is irritated with his lawyers, fires them, and conducts his own defense until the judge has enough and demands that the lawyers come back into the trial. But, the scenes where he's arguing with the judge, he's fighting with the prosecuting attorney, he's trying to convince the jury foreman of his position, and then finally cross-examining his own wife after the judge chuckles away the fact that they're bigamists and he's not going to let that privilege stay in his courtroom. So I'm glad you guys saw that. And then when you go further, the actual appellate decision and the discussion by the three judges is perhaps the most fascinating appellate decision I've ever read in my legal career.
Yeah, with the second that we saw that he was pro per, especially Mehul, we were just like going, "You got to be kidding me! What else could this guy not do?"
It's one of the things that I've held dear, guys, is that I believe that had he wanted to be a Louis Pasteur, he could have. And instead, as his quote states on the front of my book, that, he believed he was born with the devil in him, and he just let that be his direction.
I want to return back to the writing samples.
In the American Ripper series in 2017, the document examiner could not reach a conclusion regarding whether known Holmes writing samples could be a match to the Saucy Jack and Dear Boss letters. Jeff, in your TEDx talk, you show a 2011 report by Margaret Webb where the opinion seems to be that the authors are the same, and went further to have a computer analysis run at the University of Buffalo that also showed a concordance. How do you explain the difference, and who is right?
At the end of the show, we'd been going on for about 9 months in production. I was having, as often the quote unquote talent does with direction and production, we were having some issues. They were convinced that my theory that Holmes was Jack the Ripper was false. And they wanted to try. I'll tell you what happened. You remember History Channel having their fiasco with the Amelia Earhart scandal?
Yes, and I've watched that episode a number of times.
Well, they didn't want that to happen again. And they demanded that the director pay particular attention to their reputation and future ongoing. So that handwriting expert, I don't even remember his name, to tell you the truth. I held him in such low regard. He and I completely disagreed. But what I tried to get them to do when they refused is I told them I had the data from the computer software analysis from the University of Buffalo that I ran at the TED Talk. And I told them you were welcome to it. And those numbers came back amazingly high, comparing the Holmes handwriting with the Dear Boss letter. And you know what, guys? That's available. That's public record to anyone listening to your show. They can get the Cedar Fox software program through the FBI. They can run the Dear Boss letter and the Holmes correspondence, and they can run it themselves to see they come up with the same numbers that I did at the TED. And I still don't understand why we needed to use the expertise of a New York handwriting expert who obviously walked in with a bias and a preconceived notion.
That gives me kind of two comments. One is that when you were during your TED Talk, the analysis, you could actually clearly see, at least in my opinion, that they matched. They were very, very close. But it seemed to me on the American Ripper series that they, purposely chose ones that weren't close. And then it also seemed like he didn't want to be questioned. And I hate to, bash a television series, but it after watching the whole series, it seemed like history, maybe going back to your Amelia Earhart comment, had their own agenda, regardless of, your theory.
And I'm gonna applaud history. The first 7 episodes of American Ripper I thought were some of the best television ever produced. The recreations of the Holmes actor in London causing the Ripper murders were some of the best recreations I've ever seen. And I was quite proud to be a part of those 7 episodes. That last episode was just a failure. And I still can't tell you, even if you asked me straight out on a witness stand, I can't tell you what happened.
So I want to move on to Chicago. And I thought this was actually really riveting television. What about the possibility of bodies or body parts being encased in concrete in the Chicago River? And has there been any more work on that since American Ripper?
Great question. And I have an anecdote for you on that. But that episode where we were filming in the river and we found those blocks down in the goo of the river of the Chicago system, excited the whole team. The whole production crew, history was excited about it. The city of Chicago was excited about it. Everyone. But they went off in different directions. And I think what happened, guys, is they found out that it would have taken permission from the federal government, from the state government, from the city government, from the Corps of Engineers. You could have named the list on ad infinitum. And they just decided they'd spent way over budget already, and that wasn't going to happen within the time frame we had left. So they pretty much let it go. But I was at a party in Chicago, and sipping on a nice cocktail there downtown. And the mayor's assistant came over and said, "Man, I love that show you guys put on, American Ripper, with my family. That was our favorite. But we were so disappointed in why you guys didn't further the dredge of the river for the blocks you found." And I said, well, I was told that, the feds, the state, and the city would be against anything like that, and we wouldn't have been able to do it. That's the word that came down the pipe to me. And he said, "Are you kidding me? The mayor was dying for you guys to dig that up."
Interesting. I actually grew up in Illinois near Chicago, and I can remember doing the Chicago River tour. And in addition to talking about architecture and all that, they were talking about all the gross things that were in the river. The fact that the slaughterhouses would dump their carcasses in there. But man, to know that there could be body parts back there is just even more wild.
One of the historians even came forward to me, Dion, and told me that Holmes actually owned a cement factory along the river, and that it would have been very easy for him to transport bodies from the castle to the little factory, block them up, and then take them out in a dredge into the river at night and dump them.
I actually, ironically, recently did that boat tour in Chicago, and they bring up the tour guide actually mentions Devil in the White City, and then actually pointed out, I believe, where that cement factory was located on the tour.
Fascinating stuff.
So going back to some of the evidence developed in American Ripper, and we'll get into my wheelhouse now. The first prong of the DNA analysis apparently was from a shawl, supposedly from Catherine Eddowes. And my first question about that is, in about 2014, there was another high-profile DNA analysis, supposedly, of that shawl by Russell Edwards. These different tests, are they from the same garment, different pieces of it, or is there some dispute about which one is the actual shawl, or most likely to be?
When they alerted me that we were going to be doing that in the show, I was excited about it. My father and I both agreed to give DNA samples to run as a direct paternal line with Y chromosome test, I guess is what you call it. And, they said they had a fellow that said he was in possession of the Catherine Eddowes shawl and had agreed to give us a portion of it for the King's College to test against my father's and mine. When we went to see him and listening to him and putting on my lawyer's hat again, guys, it was obvious there was a complete breakdown in chain of custody. There would have been no way that shawl could have been introduced and entered into evidence in any murder trial. I doubt it's authentic.
Right. And so these people that had that piece of the shawl that you guys looked at on the History Channel, is that different than Russell Edwards' piece, or do we just not know?
I'm not sure. I couldn't tell you. I once I saw that this didn't look real, I pretty much signed that off on my list of
Right.
the million things I need to research still regarding H.H. Holmes and Jack the Ripper.
And so if I understand the results correctly, basically it said there's multiple males on there, but there's a predominant male DNA profile that was not consistent with you. Was that pretty much the gist of their findings?
I think so. And I'd rather have your opinion of what you saw there. Matter of fact, what I'll do is after the show, I'll send you guys copies of those reports.
Well, that was my next question, because in addition to finding any sort of DNA profile, you can't exactly age DNA, but very ancient DNA is going to be in bad shape versus more modern DNA. So I'm wondering if the DNA profile that they compared to you, if that was even consistent with ancient DNA. But I'm very excited to look at the report.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you, what's the meaning of the use ancient for something that's a century old when they're dealing with pyramids and pharaohs? And
I'm not sure what the technical specific definition of that is, but basically DNA that's very old becomes degraded and cut into many pieces. So when you see degraded DNA, call it ancient, call it old, or whatever, it's more consistent with being something of a historical time. It's much more difficult to analyze. And the type of data that you get from it is nowhere near as conclusive as what we get in, criminal cases now in 2019.
Well, and how many generations can you go back on a direct paternal line and still get an accurate determination?
Great question.
Well, your Y chromosome type should remain intact pretty much as far back as you want to go. Now, there can be some mutations where you'd see some differences, but typically that can be dealt with in a statistical fashion.
See, because when you're dealing with my father and mine, and we matched exactly, and then we've got 2 generations in between my father and the serial killer H.H. Holmes, we were all on the show, History at King's College, the University of Pennsylvania. We were all expecting the results to come back very accurate. And I still haven't been given a definitive answer on what really happened.
Yeah, so we'll get into the other DNA testing in a little bit, but I'll turn it back to Dion.
After Holmes was reportedly executed, and I would say reportedly in air quotes, what sort of bad experiences were happening to people related to Holmes' arrest and his trial?
And that's the subject that's in almost every book ever written about Holmes, The Devil in the White City included. But it was called the Holmes Curse. And you quickly found that the prison superintendent, the trial judge, the prosecutor, the jury foreman, witnesses who had testified against Holmes were suffering either death or terrible misfortune or horrible illnesses, which was one of Holmes's MO. He knew how to poison someone to make it look like a medical illness had caused their death. And the writers, the other authors, you can tell they were very fascinated with that subject, but they went down the supernatural paranormal path, which quite frankly, guys, I've never bought into much. So when I started seeing all the indications of inconsistencies regarding the trial, regarding the incarceration, regarding the execution and the burial, and then seeing this Holmes curse where these people who had bothered him during this process had been visited by something or someone, it raised the questions all over my head while I was scratching it, sitting there going, this is the criminal trial case I've been waiting for my whole life.
So where do you stand on this then? Are you a buyer or a seller on the Holmes curse?
Oh, he went and visited these people.
Wow.
All right, so that brings us, I guess, to the ending of American Ripper. And it sort of ended like The Sopranos, I thought. Getting a lot of information, I'm riveted, screen goes black, and I see text that says basically after months of DNA testing, DNA and dental records confirm that the corpse is Holmes. And Jeff, in your book Bloodstains, you had talked about the need for DNA testing of the remains, and you had said, quote, if it is Holmes, I will publicly apologize. If it isn't, our nation needs to make amends. Jeff, I haven't heard an apology from you. Why is that?
That's very good. I had forgotten that line in my book.
Listen,
that's what we do.
I'm in the criminal justice system. I can't help it.
I still stand by it 100%. And what, when we talked history into backing the exhumation for the show, and I convinced them that Holmes was a prankster, a macabre comedian who I was sure of, if he had been Jack the Ripper, would have had something left in that grave as an indication, evidence, or a joke. And history decided that was a good gamble to take. They set their production company on it. They spent a lot of money doing it, especially the lawyers getting a judge to order the exhumation. They arranged for the University of Pennsylvania anthropology scientists, who are the best in the world, to supervise and do the dig and come up with the evidence and make a determination of ID. So, guys, this was my dream come true. This was it. This was something I had never believed would happen. But to tell you the truth, as we were digging that grave, I still believed it was Holmes in that grave. I know I had written in my book that there was a possibility that the Holmes curse had not been about ghosts. It had been about a man who had escaped execution. But there were parts of me that couldn't come up with what was the scenario that one man could have engineered a conspiracy involving hundreds of people to escape a state-sponsored execution with newspaper reporters covering it. Maybe the greatest hoax in the history of the American criminal justice system, if it was true. So I was skeptical, but I knew my father and I had given DNA. I knew we had these great anthropologists. I knew we had engineers there doing it right. So we started digging. And as you watch the show, there were two plots. Holmes had bought two plots. The first plot we dug up was a fake empty coffin. Nothing in it. So I'm starting to get a little intrigued. I'm getting interested. This is starting to seem more interesting than it had when I was writing Bloodstains even. And my co-host, Amaryllis Fox, who I used to call Scully on the show, maybe the most incredible woman I've ever met. We're still great friends. She's married to a Kennedy now. And she talked the whole team into digging the next plot up. And the history, to their credit, agreed to do it, spending much more money. And we get this concrete sarcophagus, this coffin you would expect a pharaoh in Egypt to be buried in. And they start chipping away at it because it was too heavy for us to lift out. And the scientists are down there chipping away. They're in probably their element, their dream come true. And we spent days digging through that concrete before we came to the remains.
So, Jeff, I got a question for you that came to mind when we were talking to paternal lineage. And not to suggest that Holmes could have predicted what DNA could do, but given that the only thing DNA could resolve is whether you were sort of paternally related to the corpse, is there a chance that Holmes used a stiff, meaning another one of his paternal relatives in the grave?
Many people have brought that up. I don't know. I was gonna run through with you, as we came through to the remains and the body was lifted out. It was taken to the lab at the UPenn. The scientists went to work all summer long. They determined a body type. They determined a skeletal height. They determined, the cause of death from the cervical spine, the trauma, lack of trauma. As in there was no actual indication that he was hung by the neck until dead. The skeletons didn't match. There was a 6-inch difference in the heights. The body type was different. They were describing an endomorph, and the doctor that inspected Holmes in prison before the execution called him an ectomorph. And then, I started watching very carefully how the DNA was being engineered and seeing that there were 5 direct pieces of evidence regarding the exhumation, and 3 of them had come out negative. The fourth one was questionable, and now they were falling back on using teeth only, despite all this scientific knowledge about forensic science that the world has now.
Jeff, just to be clear, when you say negative, that means they didn't get any DNA that was useful for comparison?
No. And I'll explain to you what happened. When we were there in the lab on instructions from King's College over the conference call, the two scientists were instructed to turn the skull, perfectly preserved skull, over, and they used diamond drill bits at the back of the head to go into a pocket of bone called the petrous, I think. And they took the sample from the back of the skull, which I heard King's College state on the phone was the maximum yield, over 100 times more than any other part of the body could possibly be. They sent that sample off to King's College in London, which is the renowned tester of ancient DNA, and who had agreed to, they loved being part of the American Ripper. And they were testing. When we went all summer long with no results on a test that I was told takes 3 to 5 days. Well, and I'm sure as you guys watched that final episode, those last 5 minutes of the show, we see this conclusion come up on the screen. Dental records and DNA testing provide a conclusive link to Jeff Mudgett. Well, I was shocked. I hadn't seen any DNA test results. And I was the petitioner, and my father was the petitioner in the court case on the exhumation. I called the scientists at the UPenn and asked them, and they said they didn't know what DNA history was talking about.
So you still never seen a report from King's College?
No, I have seen a report. And the next day after that final episode, NBC News came out and said, DNA conclusively matches. That same day, one of the UPenn scientists got up to the Associated Press and said, we'd given up on DNA. We were using dental records to make our ID.
Yeah, I saw that in a couple of articles, including a Rolling Stone article, where they specifically said we could not get DNA.
That's right. So I made a personal phone call to the UPenn scientists who I was still getting along quite well with back then, not now. But back then, and I said, Janet and Sam, what's this conclusion that's in this final 5 minutes of the final episode? And they said, we were as shocked as you were.
So, Jeff, the report that you do have, what does that say?
Well, so I called NBC News and I said, hey, retract that headline you made. They did their own private investigation, and NBC News retracted their headline that it was a match. So then 2 weeks later, I get a call from History and their production team, and they say, here, we're going to send you the report that just came in from King's College, given a partial profile. And that's what I'm going to send you guys to take a look at, but it's got gaps in it. And there's a part of me, guys, having practiced California criminal law and defending bar pilots against the Coast Guard and the FBI. When I've gone all summer long, when I don't have any DNA test results, when I've got scientists saying they didn't see any DNA test results, the two scientists that the court appointed to make the DNA identification, and then all of a sudden after this final episode, we have this partial profile come up, I've got questions about it. I'm very skeptical of the legitimacy of that test.
Yeah, and then you wonder, because it's a partial profile, how much information is there for them to make any type of judgment? So let's just assume that that's a legitimate report. You know, I have this battle all the time that not all DNA results are alike. So sometimes if you have very little information, it's almost like a partial license plate. You can say, well, you know, the evidence had a 7 and an A in it, and so does yours, so therefore it's a match. But that's not a match. That's just an association, and that's a very weak form of evidence. And the two scientists, they gave a press conference about a month later, and they both said the DNA wasn't a match, but it was enough, if it was true, if the numbers were accurate, to state that whatever we dug up was a relative of Jeff Mudgett's. So to go back to, let's go back to Talbot real quick and his inspection of Holmes, because I understand that it's that article in the Journal of American Medical Association that the anthropologist referred to and got the so-called dental records.
Well, that's true. And, that's one of I've probably read that article 100 times over the last few years. And we have yet to find any association of Dr. Talbot with any entity involved in either the incarceration, the execution, or the burial. He wasn't requested to be there by the prison, by the state, by law enforcement. There's a legend that Holmes requested him personally to be the doctor examining him. When I went to the UPenn scientist and I said, I know the teeth you have from the photographs of the dental cast probably match what we dug up. But be very, very careful with that. We're talking about the greatest con that ever struck Chicago, whose MO was to use dental casts to falsify a cadaver to take life insurance money from life insurance companies. Be very careful how you use that. Let's try to form some type of chain of custody or provenance to say this is legitimate. We don't even know who took those casts, when they were taken, of whom they were taken, and how that photograph was ever made and included in that report. Those are all things that we should try to nail down before we use them as the definitive proof this was H.H. Holmes, especially when all the remaining evidence is coming up negative.
I couldn't agree more. I think that the guy was a master magician, and I think he had the unbelievable sleight of hand. And so I don't put, based on that, the series and what we've researched, I wouldn't put anything past him.
Oh, he was an evil genius. There's no question about it. And this is a man, guys, who sold gas to investors, claiming that he had discovered it on his property in Chicago, when in fact he dug under the street and tapped into the city gas line. That's what we're dealing with.
Unbelievable.
This brings up a point that you've made. I love this quote that you've said, Jeff, and it's not a question was Holmes Jack the Ripper? Is Jack the Ripper Holmes? Because Jack the Ripper is a lightweight compared to Holmes.
That's I thank you for repeating that, because every show I go on, I try to explain that to people. Okay, I'd love to be able to prove, and I doubt I ever will be able to definitively, that Holmes murdered Catherine Eddowes and wrote Dear Boss. But even if I don't, you guys have got to start looking at the story over on this side of the Atlantic. This
right.
This is the major leagues.
Right.
That Jack the Ripper stuff is the minors.
That's right. Jeff, earlier you mentioned the paranormal. Can you tell me about your visit to the post office? This now partially covers the grounds of the murder castle.
When I was writing the book, my best friend, Kim Estes, he's actually an Emmy award-winning actor in Hollywood. We both decided to go out to Englewood, and this is when the gang wars were at their highest level. And Englewood, for me, Caucasian, was a dangerous place to be. We went into the post office, and we were immediately turned down on any request for us to go down into the basement. Because at that point, I was still thinking that the post office had been built directly over the top of the murder castle. In fact, it's a little bit offset. We were there 3-4 hours trying to talk people into letting us go down into that basement. We finally did it when Kim convinced the superintendent at the post office that he was going to be considered for a part in the television series. So
that'll do it.
That nice leverage every time.
That'll do it. And so we removed the barricade from the wall down the stairs, because the post office employees did not use the basement. They believed it was haunted and evil. Well, we went down and we fought through the spider webs down the 2 flights of stairs. And guys, when I went down those stairs, I didn't believe in ghosts. I didn't believe in spirits. I was somewhat religious, but I had pros and cons over it. And when I came back up an hour later, I believed in all of them, in that there were definitely energies down in that basement. And I tried to describe it in my book about the visions and voices that I went to the neurologist later, and he said, you had an epileptic seizure, let it go. So, that place, there's no doubt in my mind that evil, horrible things occurred there. And one of the ventures we're on now is trying to talk the federal government into letting us excavate those grounds to determine if there's DNA evidence there of Holmes's victims who were never properly investigated by either the state, the city, or the feds before they bought that property and covered in that crime scene.
See, I find that's really interesting, and who knows what you can uncover if you get permission to excavate there.
I know what we're going to find. We're going to find evidence of DNA, a human DNA.
Is that something that you're actively pursuing now?
Yeah, and it's what I'm trying to do is be gentle with it. I'd like to convince the federal government that, listen, when you bought this property in 1937, you knew what was there. You knew what had happened there. You tore it down, you filled it in, and you built the post office over the top, when I think you had a legal statutory obligation to investigate those murders that had never been looked into.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think they should have disclosed, and I think they should give you access. To go on the paranormal, have you been involved, because you mentioned the presence down there, have you been involved with any other paranormal shows?
Oh, yeah. I've been on Haunted History with History Channel, which they repeat that one quite periodically. It's actually a great show done by a Hollywood production outfit that, they did a wonderful job. I just did a episode with Ghost Adventures in Irvington, the scene where Holmes murdered the little Peitzel boy before going up to Canada to murder the boy's little sisters. And that was with Zach Johnson, Zach Taylor, the star of the Ghost Adventures. It's an 11-season long show. So, there's people that periodically contact me, I think maybe wanting to see if that energy comes off me when we shake hands or something. But it's the treat I get is every time I do a show like that, I learned something new about Holmes. I learned something new about the crimes he committed. And I learned something new that puts another piece together in the puzzle. And so I'm always eager to do it.
Well, Jeff, I want to circle back to our very first question, which was about what made you feel different as a young man. So as you sit there today, do you feel like Holmes is genetically or otherwise haunting you?
If I had known who I was growing up, my life would have been completely different, all right? It maybe was for the good that my grandfather kept the secret from the family until I was 40. It maybe was for the best. The family seems to have handled it pretty well. They're all pretty much on my side now because of the book, and they're looking forward to a movie one day being made. But as far as me ever desiring to murder anyone, I never had those feelings.
I hope not.
Good to know.
No, but I like your question because I'd like that to be used in law enforcement, in psychiatry, because we watch so many shows now that want to push the idea that something like that, those genetics, those chromosomes would have been passed along to the next generation of male on the Mudgett line. And none of my ancestors, my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, none of them committed crimes. They were all good American citizens, which proves to me, guys, that this evil thing is not genetic. It's something chosen by one whose decision may be, it may be off center because of psychotic things going on in the mind that I'm not an expert on. But that, as far as that passing along thing, I think the Mudgett family might be able to disprove that forever.
Yeah, that's great. I think you'd mentioned that to me before about your family, and I think you had the veterans in your family as well.
Oh yeah. My grandfather fought in World War II. My dad was Korean, Vietnam. I mean, no, they were always there.
Jeff, you also mentioned Leonardo DiCaprio. What's his involvement with the Holmes story?
He bought the story from Tom Cruise and The Devil in the White City, the movie rights to that book. and he had hired Scorsese to do it with him, or they had partnered. That is probably a better word. So we all had been waiting years for perhaps one of the greatest movies those two had ever put together. DiCaprio gave a press conference once saying this was the role he'd been waiting for his whole life. And all of a sudden, I think 6 months ago they both said no, they were done. They were going to pass it on to Paramount, who was going to make a series with the story and feature it on Hulu. So my manager has been dealing with Paramount now back and forth, but they seem to be moving along with that project. And maybe that'll be better, because as you both know, there's no way you can fit this life of this monster into 2 hours. There's no way you're going to fit that story into 2 hours. Maybe a television series, a cable television series, will do it justice.
There's I think way too many twists and turns and information that, you're right. You'd feel a little shortchanged after watching just a 2-hour movie.
That's what I think. But I was sure looking forward to seeing DiCaprio starring the killer.
Oh, I think he would have done an excellent job with that.
Me too.
Well, that's it, Jeff. I think we covered everything that we needed to cover, and you were fantastic, and it was very, very informative.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeff. And listen, I look forward to seeing DNA reports, and if you need any help as a DNA investigator, I'm available.
Hey, this was great. I can't wait to see how the show comes out, finished product. And I tell you what, your questions, like I said, I've done hundreds of these shows, and your questions were the best I've had yet. So thank you very much.
You're absolutely welcome.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Take care.
Okay.
Wow, Mehul, I'm really not sure where to begin. What a fascinating man and story. It sounds like the American Ripper is not the end, and that there is much more investigating to be done.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, there needs to be a sequel. Jeff really seems to be disputing the DNA that was used to link him to the remains in the Holmes grave. So I really look forward to reviewing any DNA reports that he wants to share.
Well, let's put the DNA aside for a minute. The dental record identification is a problem for me. If the examples the anthropologist used to compare the teeth in the grave aren't genuine, then all of the other conclusions are meaningless.
Well, you're right, because there's a question about where Talbot got those photographs of the dental cast. So this could actually just be junk science. And I guess the identification of the body is somewhat neither here nor there regarding the theory that Holmes could have been Jack the Ripper. But just going back to the DNA, to evaluate the authenticity and the strength of the DNA results in this historical investigation, it's no different than a current-day DNA consult that I might perform. And so Jeff mentioned he's got a DNA report. Well, that's probably 2 or 3 pages of the bottom line results and conclusions. And by the way, there's certainly been cases where police officers have prepared fake DNA reports in an attempt to get a defendant to confess. So, in addition to a DNA report, there has to be some evidence that the testing was done and that the results and conclusions are based on something. And that is discovery, discovery, discovery. There should be hundreds of pages of documentation, laboratory notes, data, and protocols that all support the report. So I would say if Jeff can establish that this discovery doesn't exist, or that the discovery shows that the DNA results were wishy-washy, or maybe even completely different than what American Ripper says they were, Dion, he's really, really got something.
Absolutely. And I like the way that he's kind of prosecuting his case here. His background, he's an attorney, so he's really going at this the right way.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I'm really fascinated with this whole saga, and I got to say I'm a little embarrassed that growing up near Chicago, I didn't know a whole lot about this before we prepped for this episode. So for listeners wanting more background, you can watch all 8 episodes of American Ripper at the History website or on other outlets like Amazon Prime. And I suspect that since Jeff is still on the case, looks like he's going to pursue that Chicago River evidence, definitely need to excavate the murder castle grounds as well as other sites around the United States. Jeff's going to have more of a story to tell, and boy, I sure hope we can do another interview with him in the future because he's just an awesome guest.
For sure. I definitely see a part 2 in our future. Until then, you can buy Jeff Mudgett's book, Bloodstains, at bloodstainsthebook.com and at Amazon for an ebook. You can also check out Jeff's Facebook page for all of his latest updates. So with that said, Mehul and I would like to thank all of our followers and listeners. We really hope you enjoyed our interview with Jeff Mudgett. And be sure to subscribe to Crime Redefined so you don't miss an episode.
Thank you for listening to the Crime Redefined podcast. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Crime Redefined. Please send us your comments and questions and join us for the next episode.